Right now, inside your head, there's an object more powerful than any supercomputer humans have ever built. It weighs only about 1.3 kilograms, but yet generates more electrical activity than the entire internet did just a few decades ago. And here's the strange part. You've been using it your entire life, but you were never taught how it actually works. Your brain is responsible for every decision you make, for every emotion you feel, for every memory you hold, for every dream you have while you sleep. And yet, most people go through their entire lives without understanding the system controlling everything they do. But the truth about the brain is even more shocking than that. Because your brain is not just reacting to reality, it's actually creating the version of reality you experience. Which means the world you see, the sounds you hear, the feelings you feel, are not exactly the world as it really is. They are the world as your brain shows it. And once you understand how that system works, you begin to realize something incredible. You can actually reprogram the way your brain works, which means you can change your habits, your focus, your motivation, your emotions, and even how successful you become. But to understand how to control your brain, you first have to understand what it actually is. So let's start with something most people never realize. Your brain is not a thinking machine, it's an electrical universe. Inside your brain are about 86 billion neurons, and a neuron is a specialized cell designed for one purpose, and that's communication. Each neuron is like a tiny electrical processor, but unlike a computer chip, a neuron can connect to thousands of other neurons at once, which means your brain is not just a processor, it's a network of unimaginable complexity. Scientists estimate there are roughly 100 trillion connections between neurons in the human brain. To understand how insane that number is, imagine every star in a galaxy and now multiply that by thousands. And that's roughly how many connections exist in your brain. And these connections, they're not static, they're constantly changing. Every time you learn something, every time you experience something emotional, every time you repeat a behavior, your brain physically rewires itself. This process is called neuroplasticity, and it means something very important. Your brain is not fixed, it's constantly evolving, which means the person you are today is literally a different brain structure than the person you were 5 years ago. But how do these neurons actually communicate? And how do thoughts travel through this massive network? The answer lies in something incredibly small and incredibly fast, and that's electric signals. When a neuron wants to send a message, it fires an electrical pulse called an action potential. This pulse travels down a long fiber called the axon, and it moves incredibly fast, and in some neurons, signals travel at over 250 miles per hour. That means the thought forming in your mind right now is part of a lightning fast chain reaction happening across billions of cells. But here where it gets even more interesting. Neurons do not actually touch each other. Between them is a microscopic gap called a synapse. So when the electrical signal reaches the end of a neuron, it cannot jump directly to the next cell. So instead, the neuron releases tiny chemical messengers, and these chemicals are called neurotransmitters. They float across the synapse, attach to receptors on the next neuron, and trigger another electrical signal. This process happens trillions of times every second inside your brain, and the type of neurotransmitter released changes how you feel. For example, dopamine creates feelings of reward and motivation. Serotonin influences mood and emotional stability. Adrenaline prepares your body for action. GABA calms the neural activity. So your entire emotional life is influenced by these microscopic chemical signals, which means emotions are not just abstract feelings, they are physical chemical events happening in your brain. But here's the part that most people never learn. Your brain does not simply respond to the world around you. It actually is predicting the world before it happens. And that prediction system is what allows humans to survive. Most people imagine the brain working like a camera. You see something, your brain processes it, then you react. But that's not how the brain actually works. Instead, your brain is constantly trying to predict what will happen next. Before your eyes even finish sending information to your brain is already generating expectations about what it thinks it will see. It does this using your past experiences. Every memory you've ever formed becomes part of a giant predicting system. Your brain asks, based on everything I've experienced before, What do you think is about to happen? Then it compared that prediction to incoming sensory information. If the prediction is correct, your brain moves on quickly. But if the prediction is wrong, the brain updates its internal model of reality. This system is why humans can react incredibly quickly to danger. Imagine you're walking in the forest and you see something long and curved on the ground. Your brain might instantly trigger fear. Your heart rate jumps, your muscles tense, you step backward, but then you look closer and realize it's just a stick. Your brain made a prediction error, but that's actually a good thing because the brain is designed to prioritize survival over accuracy. It would rather overreact to a harmless object than fail to react to a real threat. But prediction doesn't only affect fear, it affects everything you experience, what you notice, what you ignore, what you believe, and even what you remember, which leads to one of the most surprising truths about the human mind. Your memories are not recordings of the past, they are reconstructions. When you remember something, it feels like you're replaying a video stored in your mind, but your brain is not storing perfect recordings. Instead, memories are stored in fragments across different parts of your brain. Visual details are stored in one region, emotions in another, sounds somewhere else. When you recall a memory, your brain pulls these fragments together and reconstructs the experience. But during this process, your brain also fills in missing information, which means every time you remember something, you slightly change the memory itself. And over time, memories can become distorted, details get altered, events blend together, and sometimes your brain even invents details that never even happened. This is why eyewitness testimony in criminal trials can sometimes be unreliable. Two people can experience the exact same event but remember it completely differently because memory is not about recording reality, it's about storing useful patterns for the future. Your brain cares more about learning lessons than preserving perfect accuracy, and emotions play a massive role in deciding which memories stay with you. Which brings us to one of the most powerful systems in the brain, the emotional center. It's a structure capable of overriding logic in milliseconds. Deep inside your brain is a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. Its job is simple. It detects threats, but when the amygdala senses danger, it triggers the fight or flight response. So your heart rate increases, your breathing speeds up, adrenaline floods your bloodstream, your muscles prepare for action, all within a fraction of a second. This system evolved to keep humans alive in dangerous environments. But here's the problem. Your brain evolved thousands of years ago, long before emails, before deadlines, before social media, which means your brain can react to modern stress as if you were in a real life threatening danger. So, an angry message, a negative comment, a stressful meeting, all of these can activate the same survival system designed for escaping predators. This is why emotions can feel so powerful. The emotional brain is extremely fast, and the rational brain is slower. Which means something strange happens inside your mind. Sometimes your brain decides what to feel before you even realize why. And in the next section, we're going to reveal the hidden system controlling most of your decisions without you actually realizing it, and that's your subconscious brain. And once you understand how that system works, you'll start to see why habits control your life more than motivation ever will. Before we continue, think about something for a moment. Earlier today, did you brush your teeth? Did you check your phone? Did you walk a familiar route somewhere? If you did, you probably didn't think very much about it. You just did it. And that reveals something fascinating about the human brain. Most of your life is not controlled by the conscious decisions, it's controlled by something else. Something running silently in the background of your mind. And that's your subconscious brain. And once you understand how this system works, you begin to realize something slightly unsettling. You are not fully in control of your behavior, at least not in the way you think. Your brain actually operates using two different systems. The first is your conscious mind. This is the part of your brain you experience as you. It's responsible for thinking, planning, problem solving, making decisions. It's the voice in your head, the narrator of your life. But here's the strange part. This system is actually extremely limited. Your conscious mind can only process about 40 bits of information per second, which sounds impressive. until you compare it to your subconscious mind. Your subconscious brain processes roughly 11 million bits of information every second. That means your subconscious brain is processing information 275,000 times faster than your conscious mind. So while you think you're consciously in control, your subconscious brain is doing almost all of the real work. It regulates your breathing, your heartbeat, your posture, your balance, your instincts, your emotional reactions, your habits. In fact, scientists estimate that around 90 to 95% of human behavior is driven by subconscious processes, which means most of what you do every day is automatic. And that leads to a very important question. If most of your behavior is automatic, how are those automatic behaviors created? The answer lies in one of the brain's most powerful systems, habit formation. Your brain is incredibly energy efficient. In fact, it's constantly trying to save energy wherever possible. Thinking is expensive. Conscious decision making requires a lot of neural activity. So whenever the brain notices a behavior repeating over and over, it does something clever. It turns that behavior into a habit. And habits are essentially mental shortcuts. So instead of making a new decision every time, your brain automates the behavior, which saves energy. But this system is incredibly powerful because once a habit is formed, it becomes very difficult to stop. Researchers studying habits discovered something fascinating. Every habit follows the same three-step pattern. This pattern is called the habit loop, and it looks like this. Cue, routine, reward. First comes the cue. Something in your environment triggers the behavior. Maybe it's boredom, maybe it's stress, maybe it's simply seeing your phone light up. Then comes the routine. This is the behavior itself. Scrolling social media, eating a snack, checking notifications. And finally comes the reward. Your brain receives a small burst of pleasure, and this is where things get interesting. That reward comes from a chemical called dopamine, and dopamine might be the most powerful motivator in your entire brain. Dopamine is often called the pleasure chemical, but that description isn't entirely accurate. Dopamine is not actually about pleasure, it's about anticipation. It's the chemical your brain releases when it thinks a reward might be coming. In other words, dopamine creates motivation. It pushes you to pursue things such as food, success, money, recognition, social approval. Your brain evolved this system to help humans survive. Thousands of years ago, dopamine motivated people to hunt, to explore, to find food, to build relationships. But in the modern world, something strange has happened. Technology has figured out how to hijack the dopamine system. Every notification, every like, every comment, every new message triggers a tiny burst of dopamine in the brain. And because the reward is unpredictable, it becomes incredibly addictive. Your brain keeps checking just in case something exciting happens. This is exactly the same mechanism used in slot machines. You don't know when the reward will come, so you keep pulling the lever. And social media platforms are designed around this exact same system, which means something surprising. Your phone is not just a device anymore, it's a dopamine machine. When you scroll through social media, your brain enters a strange loop. New information appears constantly. Images, videos, comments, stories. Every few seconds, something new appears, and your brain starts predicting a reward. Maybe the next post will be funny. Maybe the next video will be interesting. Maybe the next notification will be exciting. Each time you scroll, your brain anticipates a reward, which triggers dopamine. But here's the trick. The reward doesn't even have to arrive. The possibility of a reward is enough to keep you scrolling. And this system is incredibly powerful because your brain evolved to chase unpredictable rewards. It's the same reason humans enjoy gambling or why people get addicted to video games. But dopamine affects much more than just scrolling. It influences your motivation to do almost anything. And once you understand how dopamine works, you begin to understand something important about success. Motivation is not just about discipline, it's about brain chemistry. Have you ever noticed something strange about motivation? When you start something new, motivation feels incredibly strong. You feel excited, focused, driven. But after a few days or even weeks, the motivation just fades. Why does this happen? The answer again involves dopamine. When your brain encounters something new, your dopamine spikes, novelty triggers excitement, but once something becomes familiar, the dopamine response, it decreases. Your brain becomes used to it, which means you feel less motivated. This is why people often just quit, like new workouts, new diets, new business ideas, new goals. The initial excitement, it just fades away. But here's the important insight. Highly successful people are not necessarily more motivated. They simply rely less on motivation and instead they rely on something more powerful, and that is systems. Because systems transform effort into automatic habits, and once a habit forms, it requires far less motivation to maintain. But there's another strange aspect of the brain that affects motivation. Your brain is actually biased towards short-term rewards, and that bias shapes many of the decisions you make every day. Imagine I offer you two choices. You can receive £100 today or £150 in 1 month from now. And many people would choose the £100 today, even though waiting would give them more money. Do you know why? Because the brain values immediate rewards more than future rewards. This is called temporal discounting. Your brain literally reduces the perceived value of future rewards, and this made sense thousands of years ago. Every human lived in unpredictable environments. Food was not guaranteed, survival was uncertain, so the brain evolved to prioritize immediate benefits. If food was available, eat it now, don't wait. But in the modern world, this instinct sometimes works against us. Saving money requires delaying gratification, building a business requires patience, improving fitness requires constant effort over time. All of these require resisting immediate rewards, and that's where the prefrontal cortex becomes important. Right behind your forehead sits one of the most important parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. This region is responsible for planning, self-control, decision-making, long-term thinking. It's the part of your brain that allows you to override impulses. When the emotional brain wants immediate gratification, the prefrontal cortex can step in and say, wait, think about the future. But here's something fascinating though. The prefrontal cortex is one of the last parts of the brain to fully develop. It doesn't reach its full maturity until around the age of 25, which means younger people naturally have less impulse control. Their emotional brain is stronger than their planning system. But even in adults, the prefrontal cortex can become weaker under certain conditions, such as stress, lack of sleep, alcohol. They all reduce activity in this region, which means you become more impulsive, more emotional, more reactive. In other words, when you're tired or stressed, your brain becomes worse at making decisions. But the brain contains another system that influences almost every choice you make, and this system is so powerful it can even convince you that something is true when it isn't. It's called cognitive bias, and it means your brain doesn't always show you reality as it truly is. Your brain has dozens of hidden biases and invisible mental shortcuts, and these shortcuts can influence what you believe, what you notice, who you trust, and even what you think is true. So in the next section, we are going to explore the psychological illusions your brain creates every day. And once you see them, you will never look at your own thoughts the same way again. Because your brain is not just processing reality, it's constantly editing it. Think about the last strong opinion you had. Maybe it was about politics, maybe it was about money, maybe it was about health. Now imagine someone showed you clear evidence that you believe was wrong. What would you do? Most people think they would calmly accept the new information, but in reality, something very different happens inside the brain. Instead of changing its mind, your brain often defends its existing belief, even if the evidence is overwhelming, and that reveals something important. Your brain is not designed to find the truth, it's designed to protect what it already believes. The human brain receives an unbelievable amount of information every second. Light hitting your eyes, sound entering your ears, temperature changes, movement, smell, touch. Your senses are constantly sending signals to your brain. If your brain tried to process every detail consciously, you would be completely overwhelmed. So the brain develops something very useful, and that's mental shortcuts. These shortcuts are called cognitive biases. They allow the brain to make quick decisions without analyzing every detail. And most of the time, These shortcuts work very well. They help you react quickly. They simplify complicated situations. They allow you to navigate the world efficiently. But sometimes, these shortcuts can distort reality and they can trick you into believing things that aren't true. So let's start with one of the most powerful biases of all, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the brain's tendency to search for information that confirms what you already believe and ignore information that contradicts it. So, for example, imagine someone believes a certain diet is the best way to lose weight. When they see a success story about the diet, they pay attention, they remember it, they share it with others. But when they see evidence suggesting that the diet doesn't work, their brain dismisses it, they ignore it, or they question the credibility of the source. And this happens automatically. Your brain is constantly filtering information through your existing beliefs, which means something interesting. Two people can look at the exact same evidence and reach completely different conclusions because their brains are selectively processing information. And this bias doesn't just affect small opinions, it can shape entire worldviews. But confirmation bias is only one of many mental shortcuts your brain uses. Another one might be even more powerful, and it's called the availability heuristic. Have you ever noticed something strange? If you hear about a plane crash on the news, flying suddenly feels more dangerous, even though statistically flying is one of the safest ways to travel. Why does this happen? Because your brain estimates risk based on how easily examples come to mind. This is called the availability heuristic. If an event is vivid, emotional, or widely reported, it becomes easier to remember, and your brain interprets that ease of recall as evidence that the event is common. But this can lead to major distortion in how people perceive reality. So, for example, people often fear shark attacks, but statistically, sharks are responsible for very few human deaths each year. But meanwhile, much more common risks like car accidents receive less emotional attention, so the brain incorrectly estimates the danger. Your brain is not calculating probabilities, it's relying on mental shortcuts. And there's another bias that strongly influences human decision making, one that affects nearly every choice you make, and it's called loss aversion. Imagine someone offers you a gamble. You flip a coin, if you win, you gain £100, but if you lose £100. Would you take the bet? Most people would hesitate, even though the expected outcome is neutral. Now imagine the reward is increased. You flip a coin, if you win, you gain £200, but if you lose £100. Now more people accept the gamble. Do you know why? Because losing feels about twice as painful as winning feels good. Your brain is wired to avoid losses more strongly than it's to pursue gains. This bias evolved for survival. For early humans, losing food or resources could be life-threatening, so the brain became highly sensitive to potential losses. But in modern life, this bias can lead to strange behavior. People hold on to bad investments because they don't want to accept loss. They stay into jobs they dislike because leaving feels risky. They avoid opportunities because the possibility of failure feels too uncomfortable. Your brain is constantly trying to protect you from negative outcomes. But sometimes that protection prevents growth. And this brings us to another surprising fact about the brain. Your brain doesn't just shape your beliefs, it also shapes what you perceive in the first place. Right now, you probably believe you're seeing the world exactly as it is. But the truth is, your brain is heavily editing the information coming from your senses. So, for example, your eyes have a small blind spot, a tiny area where the optic nerve connects to the retina. This spot cannot detect light, so which means there's a small region in your visual field where you technically cannot see anything, but you never notice it. Do you know why? Because your brain fills in the missing information. It literally invents visual details to create a seamless image. This happens constantly. Your brain smooths out gaps in perception. It filters unnecessary details. It prioritizes important information. In other words, you're not experiencing raw reality. You experience a carefully constructed version of reality created by your brain. But perception doesn't only affect vision, it also affects time. And time perception inside the brain is far stranger than most people realize. Have you ever noticed that time seems to behave strangely when you're bored? Minutes feel like hours, but when you're enjoying something, hours can pass in what feels like minutes. This happens because your brain doesn't measure time like a clock. Instead, your brain measures change and novelty. When many new experiences happen in a short period, your brain processes lots of information, and afterward, that time period feels longer in memory. But when events are repetitive, your brain processes less new information, which makes time feel like it passed quickly. This is why childhood often feels longer than adulthood. When you're young, everything is new. New places, new people, new experiences. Your brain records massive amounts of information, but as life becomes more routine, days begin to blur together and time seems to accelerate. But perhaps the most surprising discovery about the brain involves something deeper. Something many people assume they fully control, their decisions, because research suggests something strange about the way decisions are made. Your brain may decide before you become aware of it. In the 1980s, scientists conducted a fascinating experiment. Participants were asked to perform a simple action. Whenever they felt like it, they could press a button, and at the same time, the brain activity was being monitored. The researchers wanted to see exactly when the brain decided to act, but the results were shocking. Brain scans showed that the activity related to the decisions to press the button appeared several hundred milliseconds before the participants reported consciously deciding. In other words, the brain began preparing the action before the person was even aware of deciding. This suggests something mind-bending. Your subconscious brain may initiate decisions, and your conscious mind only becomes aware afterwards, which means your sense of being the decision maker may actually be more like a narrator explaining decision that already began. However, this doesn't mean humans have no control. It simply means your brain is more complex than a single decision-making center. Multiple systems interact to produce behavior, and understanding those systems gives you something powerful, the ability to influence them. Because the brain has one extraordinary property, it can change itself. Right now, inside your skull, your brain is physically changing. New connections are forming, old connections are weakening. Your brain is constantly rewiring itself based on what you think, what you experience, and what you repeatedly do. So, which means something incredible. You can actually reshape the structure of your brain. And in the next section, we're going to explore how the brain rewires itself and how some people use that ability to dramatically improve their memory, focus, and intelligence. Right now, as you watch this video, your brain is changing. Tiny connections between neurons are strengthening, others are weakening, new pathways are forming, old ones are disappearing. Your brain is not a fixed machine, it's a living system that constantly adapts to what you experience. And it might be the most powerful feature of the human brain because it means something incredible. Your brain can physically change its structure based on how you use it, which means the way you think today is literally shaping the brain you will have tomorrow. For much of history, scientists believed that the brain was mostly fixed. They thought that once you reach adulthood, your brain stopped changing. Damage to the brain was considered permanent. Learning new skills later in life was believed to be extremely limited. But modern neuroscience reveals something very different. The brain remains plastic throughout life. It continues to adapt and reorganize itself even in adulthood. When you repeatedly perform an action, the neural pathways responsible for the action become stronger. The brain literally builds more efficient connections between those neurons. This process is sometimes summarized with a simple phrase: neurons that fire together, wire together. In other words, the more often two neurons activate at the same time, the stronger their connection becomes. And over time, those strengthened pathways allow information to travel faster and more efficiently, which is why practice improves performance. But the brain doesn't just strengthen connection, it also eliminates ones that are rarely used. Your brain is constantly optimizing itself. If certain neural pathways are used frequently, they're strengthened. If they're rarely used, they gradually weaken, and eventually some connections disappear entirely. This process is called synaptic pruning, and it plays a major role in shaping abilities. For example, a musician who practices daily strengthens the neural circuits related to the musical performance. Finger movements become more precise, timing becomes more accurate, reading music becomes easier, all because the brain is reinforcing those pathways. Meanwhile, if someone stops practicing a skill for a long time, those pathways weaken, the skill becomes harder to perform, which is why people often say they feel rusty after not practicing something for years. Every time you think a thought, certain neural pathways activate. If those thoughts repeat frequently, the pathways become stronger, which means those thoughts become easier to trigger in the future. And over time, this can shape your mental patterns. So, for example, if someone constantly thinks negative thoughts, those neural pathways become reinforced. Their brain becomes more efficient at generating similar thoughts. Negative thinking becomes automatic, but the same principle works in the opposite direction. Positive thinking patterns can also strengthen with repetition. Confidence can become automatic, focus can improve, resilience can increase because the brain adapts to repeated mental activity. Intelligence is not something you're born with, it can actually grow. When you learn something new, your brain creates new neural connections. The more you practice the skill, the stronger those connections become. And over time, entire networks of neurons organize themselves around the skill. This is how complex abilities develop. Reading, writing, maths, languages, music, all of these require large neural networks working together. And the brain builds those networks gradually through repetition. But learning does not happen instantly, it happens in stages. First comes confusion, your brain is encountering unfamiliar information, neural pathways are weak, everything feels difficult. Then comes understanding, connections begin to form, patterns become clearer, and finally comes mastery. The neural circuits become highly efficient, the skill begins to feel automatic. But there's another important factor in learning, something that dramatically improves the brain's ability to form new connections, and that's sleep. When you fall asleep, your brain doesn't shut down. In many ways, it becomes even more active. So during sleep, your brain begins processing everything you experienced during the day. Memories are replayed, information is reorganized, important details are strengthened, and unnecessary information is discarded. This process helps transfer memories from short-term storage into long-term storage, which means sleep plays a critical role in learning. In fact, studies have shown that people who sleep after learning new information remember far more than those who stay awake. But sleep does something even more remarkable. It also cleans the brain. Throughout the day, your brain produces waste products, tiny metabolic byproducts created by neural activity. If these substances accumulate, they could interfere with brain function. So the brain has a cleaning process. During sleep, special channels open between brain cells. Fluid begins flowing through the brain tissue, and this fluid washes away waste molecules. Scientists sometimes compare this system to a dishwasher for the brain. It clears out harmful buildup and resets neural circuits, which means sleep deprivation doesn't just make you tired, it literally prevents your brain from cleaning itself properly. Over time, chronic sleep deprivation can impair memory, focus, emotional regulation, but sleep isn't the only factor affecting brain performance. There's another ability that dramatically influences how effectively your brain works, and that's focus. Your brain has limited attention. At any given moment, it can only focus deeply on a small amount of information. When you concentrate on a task, specific neural circuits become highly active. But when you constantly switch between tasks, your brain must repeatedly redirect its attention, and this process is called task switching, and it carries a hidden cost. Each time you switch tasks, your brain requires time to reorient itself. Neural circuits must shift, working memory must reset, which reduces efficiency. This is why multitasking often leads to lower productivity. Your brain performs best when attention remains focused on one task for extended periods. This type of intense concentration is sometimes called deep work, and it allows for neural circuits to strengthen rapidly. But here's one more brain ability that fascinates scientists: memory, because the brain's memory system is far more sophisticated than most people realize. Competitive memory champions can memorize astonishing amounts of information, entire deck of cards, hundreds of numbers, long list of words, and they often do it in minutes. But surprisingly, these individuals usually don't have extraordinary natural memories. Instead, they use specific strategies that take advantage of how the brain naturally works. And one of the most famous techniques is the memory palace. This method involves visualizing a familiar location, such as your house, then placing pieces of information in different rooms using your imagination, because the brain is extremely good at remembering locations and visual scenes. The information becomes easier to recall by mentally walking through the location. You can retrieve the stored information, and this technique has been used for thousands of years, and it demonstrates something powerful. Memory can be trained, but perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the brain is that once you understand how it works, you can begin to influence it. Everything we explored so far leads to one incredible conclusion. Your brain is not a fixed system controlling you. It's a system you can train and reshape, which means the way you think, the habits you build, the things you practice are literally sculpting the brain you will have in the future. But there's one final question. If the brain is so powerful, why do humans still struggle with focus, motivation, and discipline? The answer lies in one final system inside your brain, a system designed for survival, but not necessarily for modern life. Every habit you repeat strengthens a neural pathway. The first time you perform a new behavior, the pathway is weak. The brain has to work harder, but each repetition strengthens the connection, and eventually, the behavior becomes automatic. This is why small habits can lead to enormous long-term changes. Reading a few pages every day, exercising consistently, practicing a skill, and saving small amounts of money. And over time, these repeated behaviors reshape the brain and reshape the results in your life. But there's another ability that can dramatically influence brain performance, and that is willpower. For a long time, people believed willpower was purely about personality. Some people had strong discipline, and others didn't. But modern research suggests something different. Willpower behaves more like mental resource, and that resource can become depleted. When you make decisions throughout the day, your brain uses energy. Resisting temptation requires effort. Focusing intensely requires effort. And over time, mental fatigue can reduce self-control. And this one reason people often make worse decisions late at night. Their cognitive resources are exhausted. But willpower can also be strengthened. It's just like a muscle. But gradually challenging yourself, your brain adapts, self-control improves, focus increases, but there's one final skill that can dramatically upgrade brain performance, and that skill is attention. Your brain cannot process everything happening around you, so it must constantly decide what deserves attention, and whatever you focus on becomes your reality. If you constantly focus on problems, your brain becomes highly efficient at detecting problems. So if you focus on opportunities, your brain becomes better at recognizing opportunities. This phenomenon is sometimes called the reticular activating system, a network in the brain that filters information and prioritizes what enters the conscious awareness. Think about it. When someone buys a new car and suddenly they start noticing that exact same model everywhere, the cars were always there, but the brain is now paying attention to them. Your attention literally shapes what you perceive, which means learning to control attention can dramatically influence your experience of life. One of the most powerful drivers of learning is curiosity. When the brain becomes curious, dopamine levels increase, attention improves, memory formation strengthens. Curiosity essentially primes the brain for learning, which is why people often learn faster when they're genuinely interested in a subject. The brain becomes motivated to explore, to ask questions, to seek answers, and that curiosity is one of the defining characteristics of human intelligence. It's the reason humans have explored oceans, built cities, developed technology, and studied the universe itself. But curiosity leads to an even deeper question. What exactly is the mind? Despite centuries of research, scientists still do not fully understand consciousness. We understand neurons, we understand electrical signals, we understand chemical neurotransmitters. But how do these physical processes create subjective experiences remains one of the greatest mysteries in science. How does the electrical activity in the brain produce thoughts, emotions, self-awareness, dreams, the feeling of being you? Some scientists believe consciousness emerges from complex neural networks, and others believe it may involve deeper principles of physics that we don't know yet and don't understand. But regardless of the ultimate explanation, one fact remains undeniable. The human brain is the most complex structure known in the universe. Right now, inside your skull, roughly 86 billion neurons are communicating. Trillions of signals are being exchanged every second. Patterns are forming, memories are being stored, ideas are emerging. Your brain is constantly interpreting the world, predicting the future, and guiding your actions. Every invention humanity has ever created, every piece of music, every scientific discovery, every work of art, all originated in the human brain. And the most remarkable part is, your brain is not finished developing. It's changing every day, adapting, learning, rewiring itself, which means your future brain will depend largely on how you use it, what you practice, what you focus on, what habits you build, and what ideas you explore. So the next time you feel stuck, unmotivated, or uncertain about your abilities, remember something important. Your brain is not a fixed system. It's a system designed to adapt. Every skill you learn, every challenge you face, every habit you build is shaping the brain you will have tomorrow, which means the most powerful tool you will ever possess is already inside your head. And the better you understand it, the more powerful it becomes.